The officer's grip was tight as he slammed the man against the car, yanking his hands behind his back. "You think you can just stand here like you own the place?" he sneered, snapping cold metal cuffs around the man's wrists. The man didn't fight back. He didn't even flinch. He just let out a slow breath and shook his head. "You have no idea what you just did," he said calmly. The officer smirked. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing." Then the man turned his head, locking eyes with him. "Do you?" Seconds later, the sound of a car door opening cut through the night. A sleek black SUV had just pulled up, and the man stepping out wasn't just anyone. The officer's blood ran cold as he realized he had just arrested the wrong man. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few cars scattered under the dim glow of the streetlights. Leon Carter, dressed in a sharp navy suit, stood near a sleek black sedan, checking his phone. His posture was relaxed, one hand in his pocket while the other scrolled through messages. After a long meeting at a nearby office, he was ready to head home. Just as he reached for his car door, the sound of heavy boots pounding against the pavement caught his attention. Officer Ryan Gates moved toward him with quick, deliberate steps, his expression tight with suspicion. His uniform was crisp, his hand hovering near his holster, and his sharp eyes locked onto Leon. Something about the scene unsettled him. An expensive car, a lone man standing beside it, and an instinct he didn't bother to question. "Hey, step away from the car!" Ryan barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Leon lifted his gaze, slightly raising an eyebrow. "Is there a problem, officer?" His tone was calm, controlled, showing no signs of distress. Ryan's hand tightened on his belt. "Don't play games with me. Hands where I can see them." Leon exhaled but complied, raising his hand slightly, his phone still in one of them. "I don't understand what's happening." Ryan stepped in closer, his stance aggressive. "What are you doing here?" Leon met his gaze without flinching. "I was about to get in my car." Ryan scoffed, letting his eyes drift toward the sleek vehicle. "Your car? That's funny. How about you show me some ID?" Leon sighed, clearly annoyed but maintaining his composure. He reached for his pocket, moving deliberately. But before he could pull anything out, Ryan lunged forward, grabbing his wrist. "Don't move!" Ryan snapped, tightening his grip. Leon's jaw clenched. "I was reaching for my wallet, just like you asked." Ryan's hold remained firm. "You people always have an excuse." The words hit the air with weight. For the first time, something shifted in Leon's expression, calm but cold. He didn't respond. A few feet away, Samantha Hill, a woman walking toward her car, slowed down, her eyes flicking toward the scene. Derek Willis, a man near the building entrance, stopped in his tracks, watching. The tension in the air thickened, but no one spoke up yet. Ryan pulled Leon's arm roughly, forcing him toward the vehicle. "Turn around, hands on the car." Leon sighed again, this time with a note of warning beneath it. "Officer, I think you should take a moment to—" "I said hands on the car," Ryan barked, shoving him slightly. A few onlookers exchanged nervous glances. Samantha subtly pulled out her phone, angling the camera toward them while pretending to check messages. Ryan didn't notice. His focus was on controlling the situation. "I don't have time for this," Ryan muttered, pressing Leon against the car and patting him down roughly. Leon didn't resist, but something in his expression changed. The patience was still there, but there was something else beneath it, something unreadable. Then, without hesitation, Ryan snapped the handcuffs around Leon's wrist. "Looks like you're coming downtown," Ryan muttered with a smirk. Leon let out a small breath, shaking his head slightly. "You have no idea what you just did." Ryan chuckled, tightening the cuffs. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing." He didn't. Ryan's grip on the cuffs was firm as he yanked Leon's arms behind his back, leading him away from the car. The parking lot, once quiet, now buzzed with quiet murmurs from bystanders. Samantha kept her phone steady, recording every second. Derek took a cautious step forward, his brows furrowed, unsure whether to intervene. Leon didn't struggle, but his eyes flickered with something Ryan failed to recognize. Complete control of the situation. His silence wasn't submission. It was patience. Ryan pulled him toward the squad car, his grip still unrelenting. What were you planning to do, huh? Break into a car that's way out of your league? Leon's lips pressed into a thin line, his voice measured. I gave you a chance to think before acting, officer. You didn't take it. Ryan scoffed, shaking his head. Oh, that's rich. You criminals always act like you're the victim. From the sidelines, Derek crossed his arms. That man didn't do anything wrong, he called out. Ryan shot him a glare. Stay out of this. Derek took another step forward. Or what? You gonna arrest me too? Because I see what's happening here. Samantha turned her phone slightly, catching Derek in the frame. You're not the only one, she muttered. Ryan ignored them, pushing Leon toward the car. He reached for the radio on his shoulder. Dispatch, I have a male suspect detained outside the Lawson building. Possible vehicle theft. A burst of static came through before a response. Copy that, Officer Gates. What's the suspect's name? Ryan realized he hadn't checked yet. He scoffed. Doesn't matter, I'll get it at the station. Leon finally let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Ryan frowned, irritated. Something funny? Leon turned his head slightly, his voice carrying an edge. Very. Ryan gritted his teeth, ready to shove him into the back seat, when another car pulled into the lot, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. It rolled to a slow stop a few feet away. The headlights dimmed. Derek and Samantha exchanged looks. Something was about to change. The black SUV remained still for a moment, its engine humming softly. Ryan barely gave it a glance, too focused on securing Leon in the back of the squad car. He yanked open the door and pushed him forward, but Leon didn't move. He stood firm, turning his head slightly. You're making this worse for yourself, Ryan muttered under his breath, pressing against Leon's shoulder. Leon sighed, still calm. No, Officer Gates, you are. Ryan's irritation boiled over. He grabbed Leon's arm again, ready to force him into the car, when the sound of a car door opening made him pause. The SUV's driver stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit. His presence alone was enough to send a ripple through the onlookers. Derek shifted his weight from foot to foot. Oh, this just got interesting, he muttered. Samantha adjusted her phone, making sure to capture everything. Ryan's grip loosened slightly as the man from the SUV closed the door behind him and took a few slow steps forward. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. He simply moved with purpose, his expression unreadable. Something about him felt authoritative. Ryan stiffened but held his ground. Move along, sir. This is police business, he called out. The man stopped a few feet away, sliding his hands into his pockets. It sure is. His voice was deep, steady. Ryan squinted, taking in the sharp lines of the man's suit, the way his posture radiated control. Do you know this guy? He asked, tilting his head toward Leon. The man let out a small chuckle. You could say that. Leon finally turned his head fully, meeting the man's gaze. Took you long enough. Ryan blinked. His patience was thinning, and he wasn't in the mood for games. Sir, I'm going to need you to... Then the man reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather badge holder. Ryan's words stopped in his throat. The badge glinted under the dim parking lot lights. It wasn't just any badge. It was the chief of police. Ryan's face drained of color. The bystanders sucked in a breath. Derek let out a low whistle. Leon turned slightly, looking Ryan in the eye. I told you, he said, voice even. You have no idea what you just did. Ryan's breath hitched as his eyes locked onto the badge. His fingers twitched, still gripping Leon's cuffed wrist, but now his grip felt useless. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The chief of police, Elliot Graves, watched him carefully, his expression unreadable. He let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the situation settle over Ryan like a heavy fog. Samantha zoomed in on Ryan's face, capturing every second of his slow, dawning realization. Derek shook his head, crossing his arms. Wow, this is a whole new level of stupid, he muttered under his breath. Ryan finally forced his throat to work. This is some kind of joke, right? His voice wavered slightly, betraying the confidence he had moments ago. Leon, still standing tall, turned his head just enough to glance at Ryan. Do I look like I'm joking? Ryan's grip loosened completely. He took a tiny step back, his mind racing. He looked at Leon, then back at Elliot, trying to process the mess he had just walked into. Elliot took another step forward, his hands still in his pockets. His voice remained calm, but there was something beneath it, something that made Ryan's stomach twist. "You're standing here," Elliot said slowly, "with handcuffs on my deputy." The words slammed into Ryan harder than any punch ever could. His deputy. Leon wasn't just some random guy standing near a nice car. He was second in command, the chief's right hand. Ryan felt his pulse pounding in his ears. His own heartbeat was drowning out the noise of the parking lot. Samantha let out a soft, disbelieving laugh. "Oh, this is so bad for him," she whispered, still filming. Leon, still impossibly calm, tilted his head slightly. "So, Officer Gates," he said, voice low and steady, "are you going to uncuff me, or should I call internal affairs myself?" Ryan's hands fumbled as he reached for his keys. His fingers shook, barely managing to fit the key into the cuffs. The metal clicked and the cuffs slid free. Leon rubbed his wrists lightly, then slowly turned to face Ryan completely. He didn't step forward, didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Ryan swallowed hard. I didn't know." Leon's jaw tightened just slightly. "You didn't care to know." The crowd murmured, the weight of that statement sinking in. Elliot took one last step forward, standing close enough that Ryan had no choice but to meet his eyes. "Do you have any idea how much damage you just did?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. Ryan had no answer, and that terrified him. Ryan's throat felt dry, his usual confidence, the authority he carried with every stop, every arrest. It was gone, replaced with a gnawing dread, twisting deep in his stomach. His eyes flickered between Leon and Elliot, searching for a way out of the mess he had created. But there wasn't one. The onlookers weren't whispering anymore. They were watching in complete silence, waiting to see how this would end. Samantha kept her phone steady, zooming in on the tension between the men. Derek stood with his arms folded, shaking his head slowly, as if he had already decided Ryan was beyond saving. Elliot's voice was steady, but every word carried weight. "Tell me, Officer Gates," he said, his hands still resting in his pockets. "Why did you stop my deputy?" Ryan licked his lips. He was standing by the car," he stammered. "Looked suspicious." Leon let out a small humorless laugh. "Suspicious?" He raised an eyebrow. "Wearing a suit, holding a phone, standing next to his own car." Ryan's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Elliot's expression didn't change. "Did he do anything illegal?" Ryan felt sweat forming at the back of his neck. I thought he was trying to steal the vehicle." Elliot nodded slowly as if considering the answer. "Based on what?" Ryan knew where this was going. There was no way out of it. He had no justification, at least not one he could say out loud. Leon took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough for only Ryan to hear. "You saw a black man near a luxury car, and you decided he didn't belong there. That's the only reason I'm standing here in cuffs." Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears. The words cut like a blade because they were true. Elliot tilted his head slightly, watching Ryan struggle with his own guilt. Then, in a voice so low and calm that it sent chills through the officer's spine, he said, "I should fire you right now." The air in the parking lot seemed to tighten. Derek let out a low whistle, and Samantha muttered, "Oh, he's done." Ryan's knees felt weak, but he forced himself to stand straight. His mouth opened, scrambling for a defense. "Chief, I made a mistake. I didn't know." "Didn't know who he was?" Elliot interrupted. His eyes darkened. "And if he wasn't my deputy? If he was just another man standing by his car?" Ryan felt like the ground beneath him was slipping. Elliot didn't wait for an answer. He turned his head slightly. "Leon." Leon straightened, his gaze still locked onto Ryan. "Yes, Chief?" Elliot's voice was cold. "Call internal affairs." Ryan's stomach dropped. Ryan's entire body tensed as the words left Elliot's mouth. His breath came short, chest rising and falling unevenly. His mind raced for an escape, but there wasn't one. The moment Leon reached into his pocket for his phone, Ryan took a small, involuntary step forward. "Wait," he blurted, his voice tight with panic. "Chief, listen. Let's not do this. I made a mistake, okay? Leon paused, his fingers resting on his phone, but he didn't take it out. He studied Ryan like a man who had already made up his mind but was willing to hear a confession before passing judgment. Elliot took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. His eyes never left Ryan's. A mistake? His voice was dangerously calm. Tell me exactly what part of this was a mistake. Ryan swallowed hard. His palms were damp. I shouldn't have cuffed him. I should have asked more questions first. Leon tilted his head slightly. You had plenty of chances to ask questions. You weren't interested in answers. Ryan's pulse pounded against his skull. I thought I was doing my job. Elliot's eyes narrowed. Your job? His voice remained steady, but the tension in the air made Ryan's stomach twist into knots. Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Gates. What part of throwing an innocent man against a car fits that description? Ryan's jaw clenched. He could feel the weight of every set of eyes watching him. Samantha hadn't stopped recording, and Derek looked more amused than concerned. I wasn't trying to, Ryan started, but Leon cut him off. You weren't trying to what? Leon asked, his voice sharp now. Because from where I'm standing, you didn't hesitate. You saw me, decided I was a threat, and took action. No questions, no hesitation. Elliot folded his arms. This isn't the first time, is it? Ryan's head snapped up. What? Elliot's expression didn't change. You didn't hesitate because this is how you always handle situations like this. He let the words hang in the air before adding, Tell me, Officer Gates, how many other men have you mistakenly arrested for no reason? Ryan's throat closed up. His mind flashed back. Years of routine stops, questioning men who fit the description, pulling people aside for suspicious activity that, looking back, was nothing at all. He had convinced himself it was good police work. Now, standing here under the weight of his chief's cold stare, it felt like something else entirely. The truth was, he didn't know how many times. Leon crossed his arms, waiting for a response. That's what I thought. Ryan's fist clenched. His pulse hammered in his ears. He wanted to fight back, argue, claim this was being blown out of proportion. But how could he? The facts were right in front of him. A long silence stretched between them. Samantha took a step closer, lowering her phone slightly but still recording. Derek let out a low chuckle and shook his head. Then Elliot spoke again. You need to think long and hard about the kind of officer you want to be, he said, his voice low and firm. Because right now, you're exactly the kind we can't afford to have. Ryan flinched. Those words stung more than he expected. Leon finally pulled out his phone, unlocking the screen with a single tap. Ryan's stomach twisted. Please, Chief, he said quickly, his voice almost unrecognizable from the arrogant confidence it held just minutes ago. I've served this department for 12 years. Elliot's face remained stone cold. Then you should have known better. Leon's thumb hovered over the screen, ready to make the call. Ryan's breath came out in short gasps. I'll do better. Elliot didn't blink. Not good enough. The parking lot felt smaller now, the air thick with tension. Ryan was out of time. Ryan's world was unraveling fast. The weight of everything, his actions, the cameras, the cold stare of his chief, was crushing him, pressing down on his chest like a vice. He had never felt this before. Not when chasing down suspects, not when dealing with angry civilians. But now, standing in front of the man he had just wrongly arrested, his career hanging by a thread, he felt something that was creeping into his bones. Fear. Leon's phone screen glowed in the dim parking lot light. His thumb hovered over the contact labeled Internal Affairs, the final step before Ryan's fate was sealed. Ryan knew what that call meant. It meant an official investigation. It meant everything he had done, every single report, every complaint that had been brushed aside, every stop and frisk that wasn't documented properly, would be dug up and examined. And Ryan Gates wasn't sure if he could survive that level of scrutiny. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. His breathing was uneven. He needed to fix this. Now. Wait, he said quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. Leon didn't move his thumb from the phone screen. For what? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. Ryan's throat tightened. He couldn't think straight. His mind was a storm, searching desperately for the right words. But nothing sounded good enough. Nothing could undo what had already happened. I, I wasn't trying to target you, Ryan stammered. I was just… Leon raised an eyebrow. You were just what? Ryan exhaled, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. I was doing my job, he said again, though the words felt hollow now. Elliot let out a slow breath, shaking his head. You keep saying that, he muttered, disappointment laced in every syllable. And yet, your job was to assess the situation, to look for a crime, not to create one. Ryan flinched. His eyes flickered to Samantha, who was still recording, then to Derek, who had the look of a man who had already seen too much of this happen before. Leon took a small step forward, his eyes locked on Ryan's. You want to know what the real problem is, Officer Gates? Ryan didn't answer. Leon tilted his head slightly. You aren't sorry for what you did. You're sorry you picked the wrong person to do it to. Ryan's stomach twisted violently. He wanted to argue, wanted to fight back, to defend himself, to say that's not true, but was it? Wasn't that exactly why he was panicking? Leon had status. He had connections. He wasn't some nobody Ryan could shove aside and walk away from. But what about the others? The ones who weren't connected? The ones who didn't have someone like Chief Graves stepping out of a black SUV to back them up? Ryan's mind flickered back. Brief moments, flashes of encounters he had shrugged off before. A kid on a bike who he had forced to empty his pockets because he looked out of place. A man at a gas station who had to prove his car wasn't stolen before Ryan let him go. A woman who pleaded with him to listen before he had written her off as just another liar. This was a pattern, and he had been blind to it. The realization hit hard, sitting like a weight in his gut. Leon studied him for a moment longer before looking at Elliot. You still want me to make the call? Ryan's breath caught. His eyes darted between them. His future was hanging between one decision. Elliot didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch. Then after a long moment, he spoke. That depends. Ryan swallowed hard. On what? Elliot took a step forward, standing just inches from him. His voice was low and firm. On whether or not you're worth saving. Ryan's stomach twisted again. He hesitated. Leon locked eyes with him. So tell me, Officer Gates, do you actually want to change? Or do you just want to save yourself? Ryan had never been more unsure of his own answer. Ryan's throat felt tight, as if an invisible hand had wrapped around it, squeezing just enough to make every breath feel like work. His instincts, his pride, screamed at him to defend himself, to push back, to throw out every excuse he could think of. But deep down, he knew none of them would work. Not this time. Leon and Elliot stood in front of him, waiting. The two men didn't move, didn't blink, didn't fill the silence with empty words. They were letting him sit in his own mess, forcing him to stew in the weight of his choices. He had never felt this powerless before. Ryan's gaze flickered to the people still watching. Samantha still had her phone raised, waiting for the final outcome. Derek stood with his arms folded, shaking his head like he had already decided this was a lost cause. A couple of new bystanders had gathered near the sidewalk, whispering to each other. They were all waiting to see if he would be punished or if he would somehow talk his way out of this. Ryan licked his lips, forcing his voice to work. His throat was dry. He cleared it. I want to make this right. Leon's expression didn't change. And what does making it right look like to you? Ryan hesitated. What kind of question was that? What was he supposed to say? He shifted his weight, frustration bubbling up. Look, I know I handled this wrong. I shouldn't have put the cuffs on you. I should have asked questions first. Leon's eyes stayed locked onto his, unreadable. And? Ryan's jaw clenched. And I shouldn't have assumed anything before I had all the facts. Elliot finally moved, folding his arms across his chest. That's a start. But that's just words, Gates. Ryan forced himself to hold his chief's gaze. Then tell me what you want me to do. Leon exhaled, shaking his head slightly. That's the problem with people like you. You want someone else to fix your mistakes, to tell you what the next step is. Ryan swallowed hard. I'm trying here. Leon let out a humorless chuckle. Trying? His voice had an edge to it now. Trying would have been pausing before jumping to conclusions. Trying would have been listening instead of deciding I was guilty before I even spoke. Ryan dropped his gaze. His hands curled into fists at his sides, but he wasn't angry at them. He was angry at himself. Leon didn't let up. You're so used to being right that you don't even know how to handle it when you're wrong. Ryan looked up, his expression tightening. I know I messed up. Elliot raised an eyebrow. Messed up? His voice was eerily calm. You threw a man against a car, slapped cuffs on him, and nearly dragged him to the station. For nothing. That's not messing up, Gates. That's abuse of power. Ryan flinched. Abuse of power. He had heard those words before. Usually it was in training videos or news stories about officers in other cities, other states. It was never something he thought applied to him. But standing here in this moment, he couldn't deny it anymore. Elliot exhaled slowly and looked at Leon. Take the cuffs with you. Ryan's head snapped up. What? Leon nodded, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the metal handcuffs Ryan had locked on him minutes earlier. He held them up between two fingers, studying them for a moment. You wear this badge, Leon said, his voice calm but sharp, and you forget what it feels like on the other side. Ryan's stomach twisted. Elliot's tone was firm. Every officer under my command needs to know what that feels like. He looked Ryan in the eye. So you're going to hold on to those. Keep them in your locker, your car, your pocket, wherever you want. And every time you think about making a decision based on instinct instead of evidence, I want you to remember what it feels like to be the one with their hands behind their back. Ryan felt heat rise in his face. His fingers twitched. Every part of him wanted to reject this, to throw those cuffs right back and say this was ridiculous. But it wasn't ridiculous. It was exactly what he needed. Leon extended the cuffs toward him, waiting. Ryan hesitated for only a second before reaching out and taking them. The cold metal felt heavier than he remembered. Elliot's voice was final. Consider this your only warning. Ryan looked down at the cuffs in his hands. They weren't just tools anymore. They were a reminder. Ryan stared at the cuffs in his hands, his fingers curled tightly around the cold metal. They felt heavier than they should have, like they were pressing into his skin, burning his palms with the weight of his actions. Just minutes ago, he had slapped these same cuffs onto Leon without a second thought, convinced he was doing the right thing. Now they sat in his hands as a symbol of everything he had done wrong. The parking lot was still, almost unnervingly quiet. Samantha had lowered her phone slightly, but the red light on the screen showed she was still recording. Derek had stopped shaking his head and now just watched, arms crossed, waiting to see what Ryan would do next. A few more people had gathered, their faces filled with curiosity and something else. Something that looked a lot like judgment. Ryan had been on the other side of moments like this before. He had stood in front of people who had made mistakes, who had tried to defend themselves, who had felt the crushing weight of their own choices catching up to them. He had always thought they were weak, always thought that if they had just done things the right way, they wouldn't be in that situation. Now he was that person, and there was no easy way out. Elliot's voice broke the silence. I could suspend you right now. Ryan's head snapped up, his grip on the cuffs tightening. Chief, Elliot held up a hand, cutting him off. I should suspend you, maybe even fire you. His tone was calm, controlled, but his words hit like a hammer. The only reason you're still standing here with that badge is because I choose to let you. Ryan swallowed hard. He could argue, say he had never done anything like this before, claim that it was a one-time mistake. But was it? Could he really say that with confidence? Elliot stepped forward, his eyes locked on Ryan. You're lucky this wasn't someone else, he said. You're lucky it was him. He gestured toward Leon, who still hadn't moved, still hadn't looked away. Because if this had been another man, someone without a badge, without the power to fight back? Elliot's expression darkened. You and I both know how this would have ended. Ryan didn't respond, because there was nothing to say. Leon finally spoke, his voice steady. You thought you were in control. You thought your badge gave you the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't. But that's not your job, Officer Gates. He took a slow step forward. Your job is to protect people. All people. Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears. The words felt like an indictment, like a final judgment being passed down. "You say you want to make this right," Leon continued, his eyes never leaving Ryan's. "So prove it." Ryan blinked. "How?" Leon tilted his head slightly. "Start by answering this. If you could go back 5 minutes, back to the moment you saw me by my car, what would you do differently?" Ryan's mouth opened, but for a long moment, no sound came out. He wanted to say he wouldn't have reacted the same way. Wanted to say he would have approached with an open mind, asked for ID first instead of reaching for the cuffs. But that would have been a lie, because deep down he knew himself. And the truth was, if this moment had never escalated, if Leon had been an average citizen, if there had been no cameras, no chief stepping out of a black SUV, he wouldn't have done anything differently. He would have walked away feeling justified, feeling like he had handled the situation the way a good cop should. That realization hit like a freight train. Ryan exhaled shakily, looking down at the cuffs in his hands. His reflection glinted off the smooth metal. He saw himself for exactly what he was, and he didn't like what he saw. Leon watched him closely, his gaze sharp. "See, you're struggling with the truth right now. Because the truth is, you're not sure if you really would have handled this differently." Ryan looked up, his throat tightening. Elliot's voice was low. "That's why we have a problem." Ryan let out a breath, slow and measured. His mind was a mess, filled with self-doubt and frustration and something else. Something deeper that he didn't know how to put into words. Leon crossed his arms. "So, I'll ask you again, Officer Gates. Do you really want to change?" Ryan clenched his jaw. The cuffs in his hands felt impossibly heavy now. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure of the answer. Ryan's grip on the cuffs was so tight that his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, searching for the right words, the right answer. But for the first time in his career, there wasn't one. There was no pre-written police report to hide behind. No protocol he could twist to justify what he had done. The silence around him felt suffocating, every second stretching longer than it should. Elliot and Leon stood firm, watching him, not just for an answer, but for something deeper, a shift, a moment of clarity. But clarity wasn't coming easily. Ryan exhaled, running his tongue over his dry lips before speaking. I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd murmured, catching the weight of his words. Samantha's camera zoomed in, recording every expression on his face. Derek let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. Leon nodded slowly, like he expected that answer. "And that," he said, his voice steady, "is exactly why you're dangerous." Ryan flinched at the word. Dangerous. He had never thought of himself that way. Cops like him weren't dangerous. He wasn't some corrupt officer on a power trip. He wasn't one of the names that made headlines for excessive force or reckless shootings. But was that just an illusion? He thought back to every moment in his career where he had made snap judgments. Every time he had stopped someone because they looked out of place. Every time he had dismissed complaints from people who claimed officers like him had treated them unfairly. Every time he had assumed his badge automatically made him right. And now, standing in front of his chief, his deputy, and a growing crowd of people who knew exactly what had happened tonight, he saw himself through their eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. Elliot's voice was sharp. "You don't know." He let out a slow, deliberate breath, shaking his head. "You've been wearing that badge for 12 years, Gates. 12 years. And you don't know if you actually want to change." Ryan swallowed, forcing himself to meet his chief's eyes. I don't want to say something just to get out of trouble," he admitted. "I want to mean it." Leon tilted his head slightly. "And do you?" Ryan hesitated. His grip on the cuffs in his hands tightened, the metal pressing into his skin. He let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. "I don't know how to," he admitted, his voice raw. "I don't know how to just undo this." Leon's expression didn't soften. "You can't undo it." Ryan looked up, his jaw clenching. "You can't undo the fact that your first instinct wasn't to protect, but to control," Leon continued. "You can't undo the fact that you looked at me and decided I was a threat before I even spoke." Ryan's stomach twisted. He had never felt his mistakes like this before. Never had them thrown back at him so clearly, so undeniably. Elliot exhaled through his nose. You can't undo it, he echoed. But you can damn well do better. Ryan blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. Elliot took another step forward, lowering his voice so only Ryan could hear. You've got two choices, Gates, he said. You walk away from this job and admit you were never cut out for it. Or you learn. Ryan stiffened. Learn. Leon let out a slow breath. It's not about making an apology speech and going back to business as usual. It's about understanding, about unlearning the things you've been taught to believe. Ryan let his gaze drop to the ground. His thoughts were a tangled mess. He wanted to fight back, to tell them he had always tried to be fair, that this wasn't the whole picture. But was it? Or had he just never been forced to face the truth before? Derek let out a quiet chuckle from the sidelines. Damn, he muttered. He really doesn't know what to do with himself. Ryan closed his eyes for half a second, inhaling deeply before looking back up. What do I have to do? His voice was low, controlled, but it carried something new. Not defensiveness, not anger, a question, a real one. Elliot nodded slightly, recognizing that shift. You start by listening, he said simply. Ryan swallowed, nodding just once. Leon studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. Then let's see if you're capable of that. For the first time that night, Ryan felt like a rookie again, and maybe that was exactly where he needed to be. Ryan felt the weight of the words settle over him. Listening. That was the first step. It sounded so simple, but the truth was, he had never truly listened before. Not like this. Not without a badge to hide behind. The night air felt colder now. Or maybe it was just the way his body was processing everything. His heartbeat was still uneven, and his grip on the cuffs hadn't loosened. He wasn't sure why he was still holding them so tightly. Maybe because letting go would feel too much like admitting he didn't deserve them. Elliot and Leon exchanged a brief look before the chief turned back to Ryan. You've spent years looking at the world through one lens, Elliot said. One that tells you who's a problem before they even open their mouth. That lens is broken, Gates, and if you want to fix it, you have to be willing to see things differently. Ryan inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay in this moment, even though every part of him wanted to escape it. Leon crossed his arms. So let's start here. Why did you stop me tonight? Ryan's mouth went dry. He knew the question was coming, but that didn't make answering it any easier. He shifted his weight slightly, trying to gather his thoughts. You were standing near a luxury car in an empty lot at night, he said slowly. I thought it was suspicious. Leon raised an eyebrow. Did I look like I was breaking into it? Ryan exhaled through his nose. No. Did I have anything in my hands that would have suggested I was committing a crime? Ryan clenched his jaw before answering. No. Did I run? Hide? Look nervous? Ryan swallowed. No. Leon took a step forward. Then what, Officer Gates, made you decide that I was a threat? Ryan hesitated. He could feel the eyes on him, the silent judgment of every person watching. But more than that, he could feel the truth pressing down on him, forcing him to acknowledge it. He exhaled slowly. Because you were a black man near an expensive car, he admitted, the words bitter in his mouth. Leon's lips pressed together. His expression didn't change, but something in the air did. Samantha let out a quiet breath, and Derek muttered, There it is. Elliot's voice was sharp. Say it again. Ryan felt like his throat was closing up. I assumed he didn't belong there, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Leon nodded slowly. And how many other people have you assumed that about? Ryan's stomach twisted. Too many. He had spent years justifying his actions, convincing himself that the way he patrolled, the way he made decisions was about crime prevention, not prejudice. But now, standing here, it was impossible to ignore. Elliot stepped closer. This is what I mean by learning, he said. It's not about being sorry you got caught. It's about understanding why you did what you did and making damn sure it doesn't happen again. Ryan's hands tightened around the cuffs. Leon's voice cut through the air like a knife. Tell me something, Gates. Have you ever mistaken a white man for a car thief just because he was standing near an expensive vehicle? Ryan opened his mouth, but no words came. He didn't need to answer. The silence said enough. Leon let out a slow breath and shook his head. That's the problem. Ryan swallowed hard, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. Elliot watched him carefully before speaking. There are two kinds of cops in this world, Gates. The ones who defend their mistakes no matter what, and the ones who fix them. Ryan nodded stiffly. I want to fix them. Leon's expression was unreadable. We'll see. Ryan forced himself to meet Leon's gaze. What happens now? Elliot's voice was firm. That depends on you. Ryan exhaled slowly. For the first time, he understood that this wasn't going to be fixed tonight. It wasn't about one conversation or one moment of reflection. This was going to take work. And for the first time in his life, Ryan Gates wasn't sure if he was strong enough to do it. The night air hung heavy around them. The once empty parking lot had become a quiet stage, and Ryan was standing in the middle of it, stripped of everything he had used to define himself. He wasn't the authority anymore. He wasn't the one controlling the situation. He wasn't the cop giving orders. Right now, he was just a man standing face to face with his own failures. Leon watched him for a long moment before speaking again. You say you want to fix this, but fixing it means more than just standing here looking guilty. Ryan swallowed, shifting slightly. I know. Leon shook his head. No, I don't think you do. If you knew, you wouldn't have been so damn sure of yourself 5 minutes ago. If you knew, you wouldn't have felt justified when you threw me against that car. If you knew, you wouldn't have reached for those cuffs before you even asked a damn question. Ryan clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue, because everything Leon said was true. Elliot's voice was calmer, but no less firm. Here's the reality, Gates. We can put you through more training. We can make you sit through lectures about racial bias and policing. We can slap a warning on your record and send you back out there. But none of that will mean a damn thing if you don't actually change. Ryan let out a slow breath, his mind still racing. I want to change. Leon narrowed his eyes. Why? Ryan blinked. What? I said why, Leon repeated. Are you saying that because you mean it, or are you saying it because you're standing here in front of a camera, your chief, and half a dozen people watching? Ryan hesitated. Leon took a step forward. Because if we weren't here, if there were no witnesses, no cameras, no badge in my pocket, what would have happened tonight? Ryan's mouth went dry. Leon let the silence hang, giving him time to let that question settle. Ryan knew exactly what would have happened. There wouldn't have been a discussion. There wouldn't have been any moment of realization. He would have hauled Leon down to the station, filled out a report that justified his decision, and walked away from it feeling like he had done his job. Just like he had done before. That truth sat in his chest like a lead weight. Leon's voice was quieter now, but it carried even more weight. The difference between you and the worst cops out there? They don't see a problem with what they do. You, at least, are starting to see it. Ryan swallowed hard. I don't want to be like that. Elliot's gaze was steady. Then prove it. Ryan's fingers tightened around the cuffs, the metal digging into his skin. How? Elliot exhaled. First, you're going to admit to yourself, not just to us, that you've done this before. Ryan flinched. Leon crossed his arms. How many times, Gates? How many times have you looked at someone like me and assumed the worst? Ryan didn't answer. Elliot's eyes didn't move. Say it. Ryan hesitated, but the truth was clawing its way out of him, whether he liked it or not. He forced himself to meet Leon's gaze. More times than I can count, he admitted, his voice tight. Leon's lips pressed together. Not in surprise. He had expected that answer. The crowd was still watching, waiting. Elliot gave a small nod. Now tell me this. What's different about tonight? Ryan exhaled shakily. His heart pounded in his ears. Because I can't ignore it this time. Leon raised an eyebrow. And why is that? Ryan looked down at the cuffs in his hands, turning them over slowly before answering. Because for the first time, I know what it feels like to be wrong. Elliot tilted his head slightly. Then maybe there's hope for you yet. Ryan let out a shaky breath. He had spent his entire career thinking that the only thing separating a good cop from a bad one was intent. That as long as he meant well, as long as he believed he was doing his job, he couldn't be one of the bad ones. But tonight, for the first time, he realized that intent wasn't enough. Leon studied him carefully before speaking again. This isn't going to be easy, Gates. Real change isn't just about knowing what you did wrong. It's about being willing to face that every single day. Ryan nodded slowly. I know. Leon wasn't convinced yet. We'll see. Ryan had no idea what his future looked like now. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure where he stood. But one thing was clear. He couldn't walk away from this pretending it never happened. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step towards something better. The weight of the moment sat heavy on Ryan's shoulders. He had always thought he understood the job, that being a cop meant enforcing the law without bias, without personal judgment. But tonight had shattered that illusion. He hadn't been upholding the law. He had been upholding his own perception of who was a threat and who wasn't. And that realization stung more than anything. The metal cuffs in his hands felt like they were burning through his skin. A few hours ago, they had been a tool, an extension of his authority, something he had used without thinking twice. Now they were a reminder of everything he had done wrong. Leon watched him carefully, his expression unreadable. So what now? Ryan inhaled sharply, looking between him and Elliot. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. Elliot exhaled, his eyes narrowing slightly. Good. That means you're finally thinking. Ryan's fingers flexed around the cuffs as he forced himself to stay in this moment, even though every instinct in his body wanted to walk away, to pretend this had never happened. Leon wasn't done yet. Let's talk about what's going to happen next. Ryan braced himself, his pulse kicking up. Elliot's voice was calm but firm. There's going to be a record of this. It won't be swept under the rug, and you won't be getting a free pass just because you had a wake-up call. Ryan nodded, expecting that much. I understand. Elliot's jaw tightened slightly. Internal affairs will be informed. There will be an official review of your actions tonight. Ryan swallowed hard, but he didn't argue. Leon tilted his head slightly. That means everything you've done before tonight. Every stop, every search, every arrest where you used instinct instead of evidence? He let the words hang before finishing. They're going to look at all of it. Ryan's stomach twisted. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. Derek let out a low whistle. Damn, he muttered. They're about to flip his whole career inside out. Ryan ignored him. He forced himself to meet Elliot's gaze. And if they find something? Elliot's voice didn't waver. Then you'll have to answer for it. Ryan nodded slowly, his throat tight. He wanted to say he had nothing to hide, but after tonight, he wasn't sure. Leon shifted his stance. You said you want to fix this, that you want to change. But change isn't about saying the right thing when you're caught. It's about what you do when no one's watching. Ryan let out a slow breath. And how do I prove that? Leon crossed his arms. You'll start by going back to every report you filed, every person you've ever detained on the suspicion alone, and you're going to ask yourself if you really treated them fairly. Ryan flinched. That was a task he wasn't sure he could stomach. Elliot took a step forward. And if you find something, you report it. Yourself. Ryan's eyes widened slightly. You want me to report myself? Leon didn't blink. If you really want to change, then yeah, that's where it starts. Owning what you've done. Not because someone forced you to, but because it's the right thing to do. Ryan felt his heart hammering in his chest. He had never been on this side of things before. He had been trained to hold other people accountable, to look for the cracks in their stories, to find the moments where they slipped up. Now he had to do that with himself, and that terrified him. Samantha adjusted her phone slightly, still recording. You really think he's going to do that? She asked, directing the question at Leon. Leon didn't look away from Ryan. We'll see. Derek chuckled, shaking his head. Man, if he actually does it, I'll buy him a drink. Ryan ignored them both, his mind reeling. This wasn't just about one mistake anymore. This was about everything. Every action, every assumption, every unconscious bias he had carried for years. He had thought being a cop made him a good person by default, that as long as he wore the badge, he was one of the ones doing the right thing. Now he wasn't so sure. Elliot's voice cut through his thoughts. You've got a long road ahead of you, Gates. This isn't going to be easy. Ryan let out a slow breath. I don't expect it to be. Leon nodded slightly. Good, because if you did, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Ryan glanced down at the cuffs in his hands again. He still wasn't sure what to do with them. For the first time, they felt like more than just a piece of metal. They felt like a choice. And for the first time in his career, Ryan didn't know what kind of cop he really was. The parking lot that had once felt like Ryan's domain now felt foreign, like he was standing on unstable ground, unsure if it would hold or swallow him whole. The badge on his chest, something he had once worn with absolute certainty, felt different now. Lighter. Or maybe heavier. He couldn't tell anymore. Elliot and Leon hadn't moved. They stood firm, waiting, watching, judging his every reaction. Not because they wanted to humiliate him, but because they needed to know if there was anything worth saving in him. If he was just another cop trying to save himself from the consequences of his actions, or if he was capable of truly understanding what he had done. Ryan had spent years walking the streets, patrolling neighborhoods, pulling people over, stopping them on sidewalks, demanding answers before they could even ask questions, and he had told himself every single time that he was doing the right thing, that his instincts were what made him a good cop. But what if those instincts had been wrong all along? What if he had been enforcing something that had never been about justice, but about power? Elliot finally broke the silence. You've been real quiet, Gates. Ryan blinked, looking up at his chief. Just thinking. Leon folded his arms. Thinking about what? Ryan exhaled, shifting slightly. About every person I've stopped for no real reason. His voice was quieter now. Every person I've made feel like they were guilty before they even opened their mouth. Leon nodded slowly. And? Ryan hesitated. His throat was tight, but he forced himself to say it. And I don't know how to fix that. The honesty in his voice caught even him off guard. He had never admitted uncertainty before. Being a cop had always been about certainty, about knowing what was right and what was wrong, about standing by his decisions no matter what. But now he felt like a man seeing himself clearly for the first time, and he didn't like the reflection staring back at him. Elliot's voice was steady. You don't fix it overnight. You fix it by making sure it never happens again. Ryan let out a slow breath. How? Leon took a step closer. By questioning yourself. Every single time you feel that instinct telling you someone is a problem, you ask yourself why. You ask yourself if you'd feel the same way if they look different, if they dress different, if they talk different. Ryan nodded, his grip still tight on the cuffs in his hands. That's not how they train us. Leon let out a small humorless chuckle. No, it's not. They train you to trust your gut. But what happens when your gut has been fed a lie your entire life? Ryan clenched his jaw. Leon wasn't wrong. The system had never told him to question his own biases. It had told him to enforce the law. But it had never told him to ask who the law was really meant to protect. Elliot exhaled through his nose. This is where most officers fail, Gates. They get to this point, this moment where they have to choose between staying the same or actually facing what they've done. And most of them, they choose to walk away. Ryan met his chief's gaze. And if I don't? Elliot tilted his head slightly. Then you'd be one of the few. Ryan let those words sink in. He thought back to the other officers he had worked with, the ones who had never questioned the way things were, the ones who had dismissed complaints, rolled their eyes at people who spoke about racial profiling, laughed about arrests that should have never happened. He had stood beside them, laughed with them, believed he was different, but he wasn't. Not really. Leon's voice was sharp. This job isn't just about following orders, Gates. It's about knowing when the orders are wrong. It's about knowing when your gut has been poisoned by years of bad training, bad habits, and bad policing. Ryan swallowed. So what? I just question everything now? Elliot's voice was firm. Yes. Ryan nodded slowly. He had spent his entire career believing in the system, but now he was starting to see the cracks. And once you saw them, you couldn't unsee them. Leon took one last step forward, his eyes locked onto Ryan's. This job doesn't need more cops who follow the rules just to protect themselves. It needs cops who follow the rules because they actually believe in justice. Ryan clenched his jaw. I want to be that kind of cop. Leon studied him for a moment longer before giving a small nod. Then prove it. The words settled in Ryan's chest like a challenge. Elliot looked at the cuffs still clenched in Ryan's hands. Keep those, he said. You'll need them as a reminder. Ryan exhaled, nodding once. For the first time, he felt like he was standing at the edge of something real. Something that wasn't just about his badge or his uniform. This wasn't about saving his job. This was about saving himself. Ryan stood there for a long moment, gripping the cuffs in his hands like they were the last solid thing in a world that suddenly felt unsteady beneath him. The weight of everything settled in his chest. Every choice he had made, every assumption that had led him to this moment, every unconscious bias that had shaped the way he saw the world. For 12 years, he had thought he was one of the good ones. He had told himself that he was fair, that he treated everyone the same, that he wasn't like the cops you saw on the news. But tonight had shattered that illusion, because tonight he had looked at a black man standing near a car and made a decision. And if Leon hadn't been the wrong person to mess with, if he hadn't had the chief of police step out of an SUV to intervene, Ryan would have never questioned himself. That was the truth he had to live with now. Elliot finally broke the silence. You're at a crossroads, Gates. His voice was low, steady. You either keep walking the path you've been on, pretending none of this happened, or you choose the hard way, the way most don't. Ryan exhaled, forcing himself to look up at his chief. The hard way, he repeated. Elliot nodded once. Learning how to be a different kind of cop isn't easy. You'll have to question things you've never questioned before. You'll have to challenge the way you were trained, the way you see people, the way you see yourself. Ryan clenched his jaw. I get it. Leon finally spoke, his voice quieter but sharper than before. Do you? Ryan looked at him, searching his face for something, some hint that Leon believed he was capable of change. But all he found was someone tired, someone who had seen this before. Leon had probably been stopped dozens of times before this, maybe even arrested, maybe even put in the back of a squad car by another cop just like Ryan. And none of those cops had ever been held accountable. Ryan let out a slow breath. I don't expect you to trust me. Leon tilted his head slightly. Good. Ryan glanced at the cuffs in his hands. His fingers curled around them tighter. But I do want to be better than the person I was an hour ago. Leon studied him for a moment longer before nodding once. Then we'll see. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even belief. It was just possibility. Elliot adjusted his stance slightly. Here's what's going to happen next. You're on administrative leave until this investigation is over. Ryan stiffened. He had expected that, but hearing it still hit hard. You're going to cooperate fully with internal affairs, Elliot continued. You're going to take a hard look at your record, and if there's anything in there that shouldn't be, you will report it yourself. Ryan nodded. And if I don't? Elliot didn't blink. Then you're done. Ryan exhaled. Leon took a step closer, lowering his voice. This isn't a one-time thing, Gates. This isn't about just fixing this one mistake and moving on like it never happened. He narrowed his eyes. This is about how you're going to live from now on. Every call, every stop, every arrest. You don't get to be the cop you were before tonight. You either change or you get the hell out of the way for the ones who will. Ryan's throat felt dry. Elliot gestured toward the cuffs still clenched in Ryan's hands. You want to wear that badge again? You want to keep your job? Then you hold on to those. Keep them close. And every time you feel that instinct telling you to assume the worst about someone, you look at them. Ryan turned the cuffs over in his palm. The metal felt heavier than before, like it carried every mistake he had ever made. Leon didn't look away from him, because if you ever put those on another innocent man again, you won't get a second chance. Ryan knew he meant it. The parking lot was still. The crowd was still watching, waiting. Derek let out a low whistle. Man, he muttered, shaking his head. Never thought I'd see a cop actually get called out like this. Samantha was still filming, still capturing every moment of Ryan standing there, holding the cuffs that had once been a weapon in his hands but were now something else entirely. A reminder, a lesson, a choice. Elliot took a slow step back, glancing at Leon before speaking. Go home, Gates. Ryan nodded slowly. Elliot's voice carried one final warning. And figure out if you're really cut out for this job. Ryan didn't argue. He had a lot to think about. As he turned to leave, the cuffs still clutched tightly in his hand, he felt the weight of the night settle over him. He had spent years believing he understood what it meant to be a cop. Tonight he realized he had no idea, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he ever would. If you made it to the end of this story, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think justice was served? Don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.